A quiet town is shaken by the news of a brutal murder. A caring mother died in her own home at the hands of a true monster. He did not seem to think he would be caught, nor did he care about witnesses who had seen him at the crime scene. The investigators wanted to create a psychological profile of the murderer, but they had no clues pointing to him. Then the second victim appeared. Day by day, the murderer became bolder. Would a team of experts from various states manage to find and arrest the serial killer before it was too late? In the middle of the United States, in the state of Kansas, lies the city of Newton. This city, with around 2,000 inhabitants, is surrounded by wheat and cornfields. There, religious families live who are always ready to help in difficult moments. When walking down the street, one could often see that half of the houses had their doors open, and that was normal. The townspeople trusted each other completely. But in the spring of 1994, an unprecedented evil entered the city through those open doors. Friday, May 20th, 1994, at 3:20 p.m., Anna McNeil arrived at Rhonda Krehbiel's house to pick up her daughter Gwen. Gwen was playing with Rhonda's 5-year-old daughter Net. However, no one opened the door. After waiting for a while, Anna drove home and tried calling Rhonda to find out where Gwen was, but no one answered. Anna sensed something was wrong, as Rhonda always answered the phone and was always at home. The woman became extremely worried and called Rhonda's husband. He worked in the neighboring town of Visita. The husband called one of Rhonda's brothers-in-law, Kevin, and asked him to check if everything was okay. Kevin immediately drove to their house. The first thing he saw was the handbag containing all her belongings. Then he heard screams coming from the second floor. They were Natalie and her friend, screaming. When Kevin got upstairs, he discovered that the girls had been locked in the closet. After freeing them, he asked what had happened. Natalie could only say that a bad uncle had hit her mother. Kevin immediately dialed the number from the landline phone. The dispatcher told him to wait outside and not enter any other rooms. Kevin quickly led the girls out of the house. Minutes later, Investigator T. Walton of the Newton Police Department arrived at the crime scene. As soon as he entered the house, he went directly to the bedroom, where he found the lifeless body of Rhonda Krehbiel on the bed. Her hands and feet had been tied with stockings at the ankles, covered in her blood, and one eye was swollen. The investigator had no idea what caused her death. He assumed she had been shot in the head, but he was not sure. The victim's mouth had been closed off with a white sock, and the killer had placed tape over it. Walton was certain the killer had left footprints in the room. It did not look like a robbery. Only 2 drawers were open, which contained socks. Nylon stockings and tape were also found there. Everything the perpetrator had used to tie up the murdered woman was taken from the room itself. Whoever committed this crime had arrived with light luggage and used improvised means. Under the bed, the investigator found what was perhaps the most important piece of evidence: a pair of aviator sunglasses that probably fell off when Rhonda struggled with the murderer and rolled under the bed. Hoping to find fingerprints, Walton put the sunglasses in a bag and handed them over to the forensics team. A few minutes later, State's Attorney Mary McDonald arrived. When she stepped into the bedroom, she was presented with a gruesome sight. The victim lay diagonally across the bed and wore no underwear. The bed showed signs of a struggle. The bedding was wrinkled, and there were blood spatters and stains on the walls and on the bed. Mary McDonald had the impression that the killer had carried out all his actions in complete peace of mind. The signature of this crime was shameless. It happened in broad daylight, in a residential area with houses all around, children in the next room, and yet the killer did not seem to care at all about the possibility of getting caught. It was obvious that he had committed crimes before. He knew how to use violence and force the victim to comply. The investigators combed through the house in search of clues. T. Walton examined the front yard and noticed several cigarette butts on the lawn near the large front window. He found no ashtray in the house and suspected the killer had left those cigarette butts there. Perhaps he had watched Rhonda before the attack. Stalkers are known to break in, steal, rape, and eventually kill their victims. In 1994, DNA analysis techniques were still in their infancy. The investigators did not know whether they could find fingerprints on the cigarette butts and on the glasses, but they were sure they could get a description of the murderer. Walton decided to talk to Natalie and her friend, who were in the house when Rhonda was attacked. The girls said they had been sitting on high stools eating ice cream. At that moment, someone knocked at the door. Rhonda went to see who it was. When she came back, a stranger followed her. Natalie said the man was tall and slim, with long dark hair, and he wore a red baseball cap on his head. Rhonda then said, "You girls stay here, I'll be right back," and went into the bedroom with the stranger. This was very unusual. According to Natalie, her mother never took guests there, especially not to that part of the house. The girl remembered that it seemed strange to her at the time, but she was only a child, and her parents had many acquaintances she did not know, so she did not pay much attention to what was happening. A few minutes passed, the children got bored, and Natalie decided to ask her mother for permission to play outside. She went into the hallway and saw this stranger standing there alone. Natalie asked where her mother was, but the man said nothing. She ran to her mother's room, opened the door, and saw Rhonda lying tied up on the bed. Before Natalie could even blink, the stranger had locked her and her friend in the closet. They were terrified. Natalie then thought she heard gunshots. Imagine what the girls described in vivid detail. It is hard to imagine such cruelty. Children should be protected from such horrors. Walton decided that this perpetrator was a monster. No sane person would do such a thing. He knew he had to find the killer as quickly as possible, or someone else might suffer after Rhonda. In the city of Newton, Kansas, someone had murdered the young mother Rhonda Krehbiel in cold blood in her own bedroom and locked her daughter and her daughter's friend in a closet. The killer became terribly angry and lost control. It was clear he wanted revenge for something. The officers suspected that Rhonda had known her attacker and that they had had an argument. The first suspects who come to mind are, of course, the victim's partners. But Rhonda's husband, Vaughn Cable, worked 50 kilometers away from Newton, and their daughter Natalie would definitely have recognized her father. At the crime scene, Vaughn Cable remained firm and did everything he could to assist with the investigation, answering every question. He said he had met Rhonda in the late 70s at college, and they had never parted since. According to him, he knew immediately that he wanted to spend his entire life with her. Rhonda was faithful to him, lovingly raised their children, and she was the wife he had always dreamed of. They married in the 80s and had 3 daughters. They were happy together, dancing in the kitchen, hugging, jumping on the trampoline, biking. In every interview, Natalie said she had great parents. So that she could spend more time with the children, Rhonda left her job. She taught Sunday school, worked in Bible school, and in a kindergarten. She was a wonderful person, but the life of a beloved wife, mother, teacher, and friend was tragically cut short. Investigator Walton showed Vaughn the glasses that had been found under the bed. He confirmed that no one in the family owned such glasses. Walton then assumed that this piece of evidence belonged to Rhonda's murderer. The same was true for the cigarette butts near the window. Vaughn assured him that no one in the family smoked, so Walton's suspicion that the murderer had left them behind was confirmed. The officers then sent their team to question the neighbors. They knocked on every door, went into every house, asking whether anyone had noticed anything unusual that day, if any stranger or suspicious person had come into the neighborhood. But no one had seen anything out of the ordinary that day. Usually, in a murder case, investigators have 48 hours to find a suspect. But 2 days had passed and they still had nothing. The next day, the autopsy results came back. The victim's body showed signs of a struggle but no signs of rape. According to the medical examiner, the killer wanted to rape Rhonda but got distracted so often that he did not finish that part of his plan because he was in a hurry to escape. The autopsy revealed that he had hit the murdered woman more than 13 times on the head and in the face. That meant Natalie and her friend had not heard gunshots, but the sound of Rhonda's skull being fractured by each new blow. The blows were delivered with a large, heavy object, probably a hammer. The murderer hit Rhonda Krehbiel's head multiple times with full force to unleash his anger. It was a cruel, unimaginable death. The medical examiner found no traces of the perpetrator on her body or on the socks he used to gag her. The sports socks were made of washed fabric, so there were no usable fingerprints, or the investigators simply failed to retrieve them. In any case, there were no traces. The same was true for the stockings. No fingerprints were found on the nylon. No traces were found on the cigarette butts either. The investigators' only hope remained the glasses that had fallen under Rhonda's bed. The murderer's fingerprints might be lifted using the latest cyanoacrylate fuming technique. Cyanoacrylate is heated in a glass container. As it evaporates, the fumes settle on the object inside the container, in this case, the glasses. Even faint fingerprints become visible. Fuming is a quick method, producing visible results after about 10 minutes. Unfortunately, there were no prints on the lenses. The investigators were almost ready to give up. They started going over the case file again to see if they had missed anything. When reading Kevin's statement, Kevin was the husband of one of Rhonda's sisters. Walton noticed certain parts of his story did not match up, starting with the moment he entered the house. What was the first thing he took out of her handbag? That was strange. Then he found the girls, who told him a man had been hitting Rhonda in the bedroom. Kevin was in training to be a nurse. If he knew Rhonda was injured, why did he not go to her room, open the door, and see how she was? He did not even try to help her, and that was suspicious. The investigators asked Kevin to take a lie detector test. He agreed. Everything went fine until he was asked why he did not try to help Rhonda. He said that when he reached for the doorknob to her bedroom, something told him not to open the door and not to enter the room, as if an angel had whispered to him not to. The investigators did not understand his strange words and asked Kevin what kind of relationship he had with the murdered woman. What was Rhonda like? She was very sweet, beautiful, and sexy. The investigators demanded an explanation. Kevin said he was tired and had worked a long shift, and he did not know what he was saying. They asked if he could have killed Rhonda. He replied, "I don't know." Walton's colleagues concluded from his answers that he was the murderer, supposedly obsessed with Rhonda, who had rejected him, so he decided to force his will on her at all costs. But Walton saw a major flaw in that theory. Kevin might have done something odd, said something stupid, and acted differently than others in his situation. However, Natalie said she had seen a stranger. They were a close-knit family, uncles and aunts all connected. Kevin was not a stranger. He belonged to the family, which meant the police's version was incorrect. Walton decided to speak with Kevin outside the station, so he would not feel pressured and might reveal the truth. Kevin realized he was under suspicion of murder and refused to speak further, hiring a lawyer. The situation was hopeless. The investigators could not continue questioning him, and the police had no other suspects. Everyone was desperate. Not a single clue pointed to a potential murderer. Searching for a lead, the police reported extensively on the case in the press for a month. During that time, an artist named Lois Gibson was visiting her family in Newton. She had helped the Houston police find more than 1,000 criminals. Lois saw a newspaper article mentioning that a certain Rhonda Krehbiel had been murdered in Newton. The picture showed a young, beautiful woman. She was surprised, because murders were rare in a town like that. Lois decided to finish reading the article to see how the investigation turned out. But at the end, she realized the murderer had never been found. She felt torn. Lois told herself it might not be a good idea to call the investigators because she was on vacation. However, the article mentioned a 5-year-old girl, Natalie, whom the murderer had locked in a closet. Lois realized she could help the investigation. She called the police station that same day. A few days later, Lois was invited to meet with 5-year-old Natalie Krehbiel. Working with children is easier. They are quick, even if they do not know all the words, and their memory for faces is better and more precise. Children are determined and do not hesitate. Lois talks to the victims, asking them to do something very unpleasant, to describe the person who symbolizes the worst experience in their lives. She gave Natalie a copy of the FBI facial identification catalog and used the same catalog on her easel. The victim looked at pictures of different eyes, mouths, and noses. There are almost 200 in the catalog, and Lois drew the features she pointed out. Natalie chose the images, and Lois sketched the killer's face, starting from the top of the head and ending at the chin. It turned out Natalie remembered him well. He was white, with dark hair down to his ears. When the girl chose the eyes, Lois told her there was no need to name the eye color, but Natalie immediately replied that his eyes were blue. An hour later, the portrait was finished. The girl still remembered how frightened she felt when she looked at it, because this man had just killed her mother. The drawing was sent directly to the police, and it was done with almost photographic accuracy. There was hope at last that the crime might be solved. Based on the drawing, one could now recognize the man who had terrified Newton by sight. He did not look like the husband of one of the victim's sisters, Kevin, so Walton was convinced Kevin was innocent and that the real murderer was still at large. The investigators contacted the newspapers. They printed ads and distributed them throughout the city and state to all police stations. Over the course of a month, the investigators received more and more tips. Walton checked each one, but it was all in vain. A year passed and the case of Rhonda Krehbiel remained unsolved. Everyone was sad and frightened because the killer had not been found and arrested. Everyone suffered, her family and all of Newton. The investigators had to solve the crime, but despite their efforts, Rhonda Krehbiel's murderer was still on the loose. On September 23, 1995, something changed. Walton got a call from the police in the neighboring town of Wichita. A young woman named Janet McCann had gone missing. Walton had no idea that the lead he had been searching for all along was 50 kilometers from Newton. For more than a year, Newton police officers had been trying to track down the criminal who had murdered the housewife Rhonda Krehbiel in cold blood. Detectives in the neighboring town of Wichita asked them for help in investigating Janet McCann's disappearance. She was in her early 30s and worked as an escort on South Broadway Street. A man approached her and offered her money to spend the night with him. Janet agreed, but her friend Emma tried to talk her out of it. However, she insisted everything was fine and left. Emma did not like this man at all. She felt something was off and wrote down his car's license plate, in case her friend did not return. The next day, Emma's fears were confirmed. Janet was nowhere to be found. Emma called the police and reported that she had not seen the man's face, but had taken down the car's number. The car was registered to a certain Chester Higginbotham who lived in Newton, Kansas. Investigator Walton immediately obtained a search warrant. Since no one was home, he offered to break down the door. At that moment, Chester Higginbotham and his wife Jenna pulled up. She was surprised to see so many officers outside their house and did not understand what they wanted. Chester said he would handle everything and asked his wife to stay in the car. Then he walked over to the officers, spoke with them, and agreed to come in for questioning. Investigator Walton stayed behind to assist in the search. The forensics team looked for any sign of Janet McCann in the house, whether she had left her handbag or other items behind. The search warrant also covered Higginbotham's car, but the police found nothing. Walton then headed to the station where the suspect was being interrogated. At first, Chester denied ever having met the missing woman. When pressed, he admitted he had been with Janet McCann but claimed he had only taken her to the bus station where he supposedly last saw her. The investigators did not believe him. A friend of the victim stated that Janet had nowhere to go outside of town. Moreover, the police checked Higginbotham's story and discovered that the station had been closed long before he claimed to have taken her there. The investigators conducted a background check and discovered more. Chester Higginbotham had been convicted multiple times for burglary and robbery. Over the last 10 years, he had frequently ended up in jail for petty crimes. In the early 90s, he moved to Newton. To learn more about him, Walton invited his wife Jenna to the station. She said she worked as a cashier at a gas station on the north side of town. A man came in often, bringing his cup, asking for a drink, sometimes cigarettes. His smile made Jenna's heart skip a beat. She was very excited when he asked her out. After a while, Higginbotham confessed his love for Jenna. They dated for 6 months. He worked as a waiter and mechanic, saved up for a ring, and proposed to her. At first, he was a good husband, but sometimes he drank. Once, when he was drunk, he flew into a rage and broke through the bedroom wall. Jenna was scared to death at the time but said nothing. Chester wanted control, and Jenna never caused him problems. She stayed out of his way, did not argue, and respected his authority. Investigator Walton then explained why her husband had been invited to the station. He told Jenna outright that Chester was suspected of kidnapping the escort Janet McCann from Wichita and taking her to Newton. He was the last person seen with her, and no one had seen her since. Jenna did not want to believe it, because it was her husband they were talking about. But after a brief silence, she revealed something strange that had happened a few days earlier. Chester went out with friends that evening. Around 11:30 or 11 p.m., Jenna thought it was time for him to come home. An hour passed, and he was still missing. She began to worry that something had happened to him. Jenna got in her car and drove to the warehouse where her husband kept parts and worked. He was indeed there, saying he was loading parts for an oil change the next morning. Jenna noticed he was not alone. She asked who the woman in his car was. Chester replied that she was an acquaintance of an acquaintance, and he had been asked to give her a ride. While Jenna was talking to him, the strange woman did not move. It looked like she was not sitting but half lying there. Jenna was shocked. At home, she started praying that the woman was still alive and well. 15 or 20 minutes later, Chester came home and they went to bed, but Jenna had a bad feeling. Something told her something irreversible had happened. However, she was too scared to go to the police. Investigator Walton suspected that the woman in Chester's car had to be Janet McCann, and she was probably dead by that time. He also assumed that her body was still at the warehouse. After obtaining a search warrant and thoroughly combing the place, the investigators found no trace of Janet. However, the police discovered suspicious items: nylon ropes, tape, and cable ties. They did not know if these items would help the investigation, since no traces were found, but they were kept as evidence. The officers arrested Higginbotham for having involvement with an escort, convinced he had killed Janet McCann. They did not want him to flee or hide her body. While he was locked up, the investigators had time and began searching. For weeks, the police scoured abandoned buildings, fields, and lakes. In October, a worker discovered something suspicious by the roadside: a badly decomposed body. The woman was lying face down, with her legs bent at the knees and her wrists tied. That is how cattle are restrained. Her face was sealed with tape, covering her nose and mouth. Piece by piece, the puzzle began to come together for Investigator Walton. He saw the whole picture. Janet McCann lay before him, and he knew who had killed Rhonda Krehbiel. 1 month after 36-year-old Janet McCann drove away with Chester Higginbotham, her decomposed remains were discovered in a ditch 50 kilometers from Wichita. She died a gruesome death, and the method of murder was familiar to the investigators. When Investigator Walton saw Janet McCann's body, it reminded him immediately of Rhonda Krehbiel. They said if you compared photos of Rhonda's crime scene with those of Janet, there would be practically no difference. It was very unusual for 2 women to be killed and tied up in the same way in such a small jurisdiction. Suddenly, The investigators realized that Chester Higginbotham, the suspect in Janet's murder, bore a striking resemblance to the description they had gotten from Rhonda's killer. Chester had cut his hair short after the first murder, but his face and mustache were exactly as they appeared in Lois Gibson's sketch. A highly disturbing realization set in. They had spent far too long looking for Rhonda's murderer, allowing Chester to claim a second victim, Janet McCann. However, the police still did not have enough evidence to convict him of that crime. It was impossible to obtain the perpetrator's DNA. The victim's body was decomposed, and it was impossible to prove the perpetrator had had intercourse with the murdered woman. The police had no right to keep Higginbotham behind bars without proof of his guilt in the murders of Janet and Rhonda, but if they released him, he would certainly kill again. Investigator Walton was at a loss, knowing he had Rhonda's murderer in his hands but lacking the final piece of the puzzle to implicate him. He took another look at Rhonda's file and reviewed the evidence. The striking resemblance to the sketch was noteworthy, but it was not enough to justify an arrest. The cigarette butts found on the street contained no traces, and in 1995, it was impossible to extract DNA from them. The aviator glasses showed no fingerprints either. Then Walton decided to try something and called Higginbotham's wife. First, he told her that Chester was suspected of another murder. Then Walton asked her what brand of cigarettes her husband smoked. Jenna immediately named the exact brand of cigarette butts found outside Rhonda Krehbiel's home. The investigator then asked if her husband wore sunglasses. Jenna said he wore the same kind of aviator sunglasses that had been found under the bed in Rhonda's house. Walton realized that this man could not slip through the cracks. A few days later, investigator Walton heard that FBI agents would be holding a master class on preserving evidence. He attended the lecture and learned that the technology had improved in the meantime. DNA could now even be isolated from eyeglass lenses. Walton immediately thought of the glasses found in Rhonda's home. He contacted the medical examiner and asked if they could extract DNA by smoking out the glasses. The medical examiner replied that maybe they could try. Walton sent the glasses along with a sample of Higginbotham's blood to the state crime lab. In the lab, experts had great difficulty removing the chemicals from the lenses, which took several hours. Then swabs were taken from the lenses, and they waited for months for the results. While investigator Walton waited, he and his colleagues tried to put together a detailed psychological profile of the serial killer who had been targeting women in his town. During the investigation, they learned that his mother was an older woman who had conceived him by a lover. At the age of 6 or 7, meaning very early on, Chester Higginbotham began stealing from stores and soon ended up on the police radar. He was taken from his home and moved among foster families. In one of them, he was abused by the foster parents, who locked the boy in a dark closet as punishment, just as he had locked Rhonda's daughter Natalie and her friend in a closet. But if he killed Rhonda, why did he leave witnesses? The investigators believe that, in a certain way, he felt connected to them, that he felt sorry for them and spared their lives. Meanwhile, Walton looked into what Higginbotham had done in May 1994, when Rhonda was killed. Chester had not yet met Jenna. He was living in a halfway house 2 blocks from Rhonda's house, and passed by her home every day on his way to work at a restaurant. Investigators questioned employees at the restaurant. One of them said that Rhonda and her church friends had dinner there a week before the tragedy. The manager who normally served that area was away that day, so Rhonda had a question about the bill and called the waiter over. It was Chester Hibbott. They had a heated argument in the restaurant, and he became angry, insulting Rhonda and saying he did not care what she thought. The police suspected that this incident drove him to murder because he hated women and wanted to control them completely. Walton's version was confirmed. The Wichita police informed him of the forensic findings from the scene of Janet McCann's murder and the warehouse. Experts discovered that the gray tape found in the warehouse matched the tape used by the killer to tape Janet's mouth shut, and that the torn edge of the tape matched perfectly. They also found that the nylon rope used to bind Janet's hands and feet came from the same source that was found there. Chester Higginbotham was charged with murdering Janet McCann. On one hand, Many were relieved that Chester would spend the rest of his life behind bars, and such a crime would not happen again. On the other hand, the case of Rhonda Krehbiel remained unsolved. Then more good news arrived. The state crime lab had found DNA on the glasses from Rhonda's house. Chester Higginbotham's DNA was on them. Investigator Walton was overjoyed. Finally, there was proof that Chester had been in that bedroom, near the bed where Rhonda was murdered. On May 20th, 1996, almost 2 years after the tragedy, the police were able at last to piece together exactly how Rhonda Krehbiel was killed. When she opened the door, she immediately realized she was in danger. Her first thought was how to protect the girls. Rhonda was willing to do anything Chester told her, as long as she could save them. Chester entered the house. Initially, he only wanted to rape her, but he had no time because he was interrupted. His thirst for power and anger surfaced, and he grabbed a hammer and beat Rhonda to death. Chester Higginbotham is the true embodiment of evil. Neither words nor any other means could make him feel empathy for his victims or their families. People like Higginbotham are the reason prisons exist. On August 1st, 1996, Chester Higginbotham was found guilty of murdering Janet McCann and was sentenced to 40 years in prison. On December 2nd of the same year, he was sentenced to another 40 years in prison for the murder of Rhonda Krehbiel. He is serving both sentences at Lansing Correctional Facility in Kansas and has no chance of parole. Thank you for watching, and take care.